From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
It's been called the worst treatment disaster in NHS history.
This is a disaster that has taken lives and ruined lives.
It's taken decades, thousands of deaths, and a relentless battle to have their harrowing stories heard.
In the 1970s and 80s, tens of thousands of NHS patients were given blood infected with HIV and hepatitis C. A public inquiry was launched in 2018, and yesterday, it finally published its report.
What I've found is that disaster was no accident. People put their trust in doctors and the government to keep them safe, and that trust was betrayed.
It's not only a cover-up, it's actually an abuse by many people who were set to supposedly care for us.
We've been gaslit for generations. This report today brings an end to that.
But for thousands of victims, it comes far too late.
And as I sit here as one of 27,000 blood transfusion victims, that's what echoes in my head. Behind every one of those 27,000 is a family.
This is a day of shame for the British state. I want to make a wholehearted and unequivocal apology for this terrible injustice. We will pay comprehensive compensation to those infected and those affected by this scandal, accepting the principles recommended by the inquiry. Whatever it costs to deliver this scheme, we will pay it.
Today, we're revisiting our conversation with Caroline Wheeler from the Sunday Times, whose journalism helped to bring about this landmark inquiry. And we'll bring you an update from her on what the inquiry actually found. The story today: a bloody disgrace, how the infected blood victims were betrayed by a cover-up.
I'm Caroline Wheeler and I'm the political editor of the Sunday Times.
Caroline, this is a very personal story for you. You've got a copy of the book you've just written about it on the desk, but this is a story that you have followed for a long time. Just take us back to where it began for you.
Well, it began right at the very beginning of my career. I mean, literally at the very beginning of my career. This was in 2001, and I'd been given a place on the Trinity Mirror trainee scheme in Birmingham. And one of the very first phone calls that I ever took into the newsroom, there were always these things called ring-ins. And they were always a bit of a kind of initiation test, sort of dealing for the first time with the great British public. I had this amazing phone call from a guy called Mick Mason. He called straight through to the newsroom, and the call got passed on to me. And it was this 34-year-old who was telling me that he had been infected with hepatitis C, HIV, and he now feared that he had been infected with the human version of the mad cow disease, which was all in the news at the time.
Oh, God.
And started telling me this absolutely unbelievable story about how he'd been infected by contaminated blood products.
And this is one of your first days on the job. You know, when you're hearing this...
First days on the job.
What are you thinking?
I'm thinking this is a conspiracy theorist. This is somebody that is trying to catch me out or has been put up to it by the news desk. And I came off the phone call and started doing a bit of research into this particular subject. And although what he told me is the stuff of nightmares, actually every word of it turned out to be true. It was such an eye-opener to me at that time. I was only 21 years old. And to be told such an absolutely horrific story, I found absolutely astonishing that this wasn't on the front page of every newspaper, that this had occurred. And yet all I could really find was snippets of information on the internet.
And for you, this begins a 2-decade journey pursuing this story. Just take us back to Mick, though, the man who phoned in.
So Mick was a haemophiliac, and this story affects mainly haemophiliacs, but not exclusively haemophiliacs. And haemophilia basically means that you have a coagulation factor that's missing from your blood, which has to be supplemented using blood products in order to ensure that your blood clots when you've had a knock or a bump. Haemophiliacs need to have this coagulation factor in order to not basically bleed to death, which is a very real concern for haemophiliacs that this could happen.
Yeah.
And Mick found out when he was 18 that he'd been infected with HIV, having received these contaminated blood products.
So these are blood products he's given in order to make his blood coagulate, to stop it being too thin. He's actually being supplemented.
Yeah, exactly. So the very drugs that ostensibly are being given to him to save his life, to ensure that he doesn't suffer a life-threatening bleed, in this blood factor is HIV, and he is infected with HIV. But he doesn't know he's infected with it. And actually, the way in which he discovers that he's been infected with HIV is, again, another jaw-dropping episode in this story. In that at 18 years old, he's sent a diet sheet by his doctors advising him on the best types of food to be eating for individuals that have been infected with HIV.
That's how he finds out?
That's how he finds out. And this is not a one-off. Of all the individuals that I spoke to for the book, many of whom had been either co-infected with HIV and hepatitis C or had one or the other, the stories were similar in almost every occasion, that they were diagnosed with these infections but were not told for a substantial period of time. And also, they received these blood products but were not warned of the risks, even though the risks were well known, which raises really profound questions about what was going on during this period.
It's shocking. And then you say that Mick wasn't unusual. I mean, do we have a sense of how many people ultimately were infected with contaminated blood? How many people's lives were changed by this?
So the estimates put it around 5,000 people. It's known as the worst treatment disaster in NHS history. And of those 5,000, more than half have now died. And the scale of it is not really known. It could well exceed that because it also affected non-haemophiliacs, some of those who were given blood products during routine blood transfusions, for example, if there'd been a car crash or during childbirth. And it's estimated that around 35,000 people, in addition to the haemophiliacs that were infected, were also infected, particularly with hepatitis C during this period.
Just take us back a step. I mean, how exactly do we end up with contaminated blood in the NHS? I mean, where does this begin?
Well, it's really a sort of story of medical advancements, really. In the 1960s, Dr. Judith Graham Poole discovered a process of freezing and thawing plasma so that they could get a kind of rich layer of factor-rich plasma that could be used to transfuse haemophiliacs. And that
factor, is this the stuff that coagulates the blood?
That's exactly right. So as I mentioned before, particularly in haemophiliacs, they're missing this coagulation factor. And the coagulation factor for haemophiliacs of haemophilia A is factor 8. And after this discovery of how this plasma could be frozen and thawed, this led to more advancements in the treatment of haemophilia.
So you've got an amazing period of amazing discoveries that could transform the way haemophiliacs in particular live. How does that lead to contaminated blood?
So putting it simply, you just couldn't make enough of this stuff in the UK. Demand very quickly outstripped supply. There was a real clamour for this life-changing plasma. And indeed, the UK has never been self-sufficient in this ever since the start of this process.
So not enough people donating blood.
Not enough people. So it meant that often the establishment turned to places like America, which had a very different donation system to the UK and was based on people being paid to give donations. And there was a really obvious warning about some of the horrors that were to come, right the way back in 1975.
A World in Action investigator spent 4 weeks visiting plasma centres, selling plasma, talking to donors and examining safeguards. Tonight, World in Action investigates the health risk to Britain's haemophiliacs from the men who sell their blood in America.
So World in Action there were 24 Highland clinics across the United States.
These are the clinics that take blood?
That's correct. It focused on one in San Jose near San Francisco. And the film crew turned up and saw and witnessed individuals, often down and outs, drug addicts and alcoholics, were on a kind of list of individuals where it was deemed to be a risk, particularly of hepatitis, for example, and so it was deemed that they should not give blood. But often the rules were completely ignored.
By offering to sell plasma in 5 Highland centres, we established even more disturbing facts. 1, no check was made on the false addresses we gave. This can admit down and outs, a high hepatitis risk. 2, Highland doctors did not always carry out the only checks that can detect drug users. Drug users are among the highest risk for hepatitis. 3, physical examinations were not always done fully, though certified as such. 4, certain medical questions were not asked, but were filled in as having been answered satisfactorily.
It became a really established practice, particularly on Skid Row, for people to go and do this, so much so that there was even a kind of nickname given to it, which was ooze for booze. So people would go and ooze, give blood, to get the money to pay for the booze. And the story kind of gets worse from there, really, which was it wasn't just people that were being paid to give blood on the streets. There were also setups within prisons where inmates were paid up to $7 for a pint of blood, which was then pooled with other blood, and that was where it became really dangerous.
Pooled?
It was pooled, so all the blood was mixed together and then made into the factor concentrate, which meant effectively if one batch of blood had been infected with any of these diseases...
So if any one person out of that pool...
Yeah, was infected, then the entire batch became infected.
That's astonishing. I mean, that World in Action came out in 1975, so people in Britain, they knew there was not the same sort of screening. When did it start coming into the NHS?
Well, it was there at that particular time.
And it didn't stop?
In 1975, there was reports in some of the medical journals in the United Kingdom that a group of haemophiliacs had been infected with hepatitis. The issue had been around one particular maker of factor VIII, and that factor VIII had come in from the United States. So for anybody to argue that the risks were not known about at that time is completely for the birds. That warning in 1975 was one of a whole host of warnings about the impact of contaminated blood and it entering the NHS supply chain.
And back then, once it's come into the NHS, you know, as you say, it's not only haemophiliacs who are being given the factor VIII. I mean, I was really surprised to read that Anita Roddick, for example, was one of the early patients who was given it. I mean, just tell us a bit about her story.
Yeah, I mean, lots of people kind of don't remember that bit about Anita Roddick's death. Anita Roddick was obviously the founder of the Body Shop. She was one of Britain's richest people at the height of her empire.
Great female entrepreneur.
And a great female entrepreneur. And she allegedly, and it's only ever been claimed that this was the case, was infected in 1971. So she would have been one of the first cases. And she believes, or her family believe, that she was infected when she gave birth to her daughter Samantha. But she didn't find out for another 30 years. And it was only when she was having some medical tests done that it was actually flagged that she did have hepatitis C. And she quickly became fairly vocal about it, became a member of the Hepatitis C Trust, and talked about the fact that she had, by that point, got cirrhosis of the liver. And it's important to remember with hepatitis C that it can stay dormant for a very long time, attacking the liver without anybody knowing about it, which is why we're never really going to know the true scale of this tragedy, because still today there could be people who were infected who have no idea that they were infected, but it will be silently eroding their liver function.
Wow. And for Anita Roddick, who did die young, tragically, for her family, they think this, factor VIII, contaminated blood, was part of the problem.
So I spoke to her daughter, Samantha, several years ago about it, and her daughter very much equates her early demise with this transfusion that she received. And she actually thinks it's, incredibly sad, given Anita Roddick's commitment to looking at the supply chains and making sure that they were ethical supply chains in the production of goods for the Body Shop, that actually she herself died because of the contamination of the blood supply chain.
Wow. And as you say, she was given the factor VIII during childbirth, but a lot of the people who did get it around that era were haemophiliacs, many of them children.
Yes, the most shocking part of this story for me has been the way in which particularly children were effectively experimented on by haematologists during this period in order to work out whether these blood products were infected with deadly diseases. And there are memos, which I've included in the book, which shows that these individuals were knowingly being tested on. So in January 1982, Professor Bloom, who is one of the key haematologists that's been involved in the treatment of haemophiliacs and actually plays a very important role in this story, he wrote a letter that basically confirmed that haemophiliacs were being experimented on. This is what Bloom wrote. Although initial production batches may have been tested for infectivity by injecting them into chimpanzees, it is unlikely that the manufacturers will be able to guarantee this form of quality control for all future batches. It is therefore very important to find out by studies in human beings to what extent the infectivity of the various concentrates had been reduced. The most clear-cut way of doing this is by administering those concentrates to patients not previously exposed to large pool concentrates. And of course, those that were not previously exposed were generally children, which is why when there's been analysis done of this particular tragedy, around a third of those that were infected with HIV were children.
I mean, this is jaw-dropping. You don't really imagine scientists thinking like that. You don't imagine medics sort of thinking it's cheaper to experiment on children. How exactly did they go about doing that?
Well, there were a number of trials that were done during the course of these infectivity trials. The one that stands out for me was a trial which took place again in 1982. There was a school that is in Alton in Hampshire, which has become known as the School of Death.
The College and Trust were founded over 75 years ago by Sir William Purdy Treloar, Lord Mayor of London, to alleviate the suffering of the little cripples of the City of London, to educate and to train them. Today, Lord Mayor Treloar College is the largest independent co-educational boarding school of its kind in the country, devoted entirely to the needs of disabled boys and girls.
From the 50s onwards, it became a place and a magnet for children with haemophilia, simply because it was much easier to manage the condition when there was a health centre on site. And in 1982, there was a trial done at this particular school, which involved 50 schoolchildren by one particular pharmaceutical company. And I have been told that of the 50 children who were involved in that particular trial, all 50 of them were infected with HIV.
These are children with haemophilia already. They're at a school for special care, and instead they're being infected by HIV while they're there. Have you managed to speak to any of them?
So I've spoken to quite a number of them. The story that I have chosen to tell in the Sunday Times with the launch of the book is the story of Aid Goodyear. Aid Goodyear, who you wouldn't believe is the most cheerful, upbeat human being you could possibly ever imagine, given such tragedy has befallen him. He found out in 1985 that he had been infected with HIV in the most extraordinary way. He was summoned to the health centre on a very beautiful sunny afternoon in May 1985. There were 5 of them, him and his schoolmates, called in to see the director of haematology at the centre called Dr. Arenstam. And as they were gathered, one of the nurses that was with them started weeping. Aid was told that he had been given HIV as Dr. Arenstam pointed to the boys and told them which one of them had been affected or hadn't been infected with the words, "You have, you haven't, you have, you haven't." And the last time he uttered the words, "You have," it was when Dr. Arenstam was pointing at Aid. And that's how Aid found out that he had HIV.
In the headmaster's study, in front of other boys.
Yeah. And actually, one of the saddest things that I know from what Aid's told me since is that although they were not all told that day that they'd been infected with HIV, they did all subsequently get infected, and Aid is the only one alive today.
What's actually happened to the school that was known as the School of Death? Was it shut down after that?
The school is still there. It's still there. It's no longer the magnet that it was for haemophiliacs, but it's still there. There is a class action which has been taken by some of the former pupils against the school, but the school believes that it didn't fail in its duty of care, but that the liability for what happened to these students rests with the NHS.
Caroline, you told us earlier about some of the experiments that were being carried out by medics at the time, by Dr. Bloom in particular. You mentioned a very renowned haematology expert back then. One of the final chapters in your book is just called Colin. Tell us a bit about his story.
So Colin Smith was infected with HIV when he was just 2 years old. He was a previously untreated patient. He was infected, or certainly he found out that he'd been infected with HIV in 1983. And what is most shocking about Colin's story to me is that 1 month prior to him being infected, Professor Bloom, who was in charge of his treatment, had actually issued a new memo to the kind of haematology community, advising them to stop using the factor 8, imported factor 8, because they knew of the HIV risk. It's never been explained why Colin was given factor 8, particularly because he hadn't needed it in the past. It was for a routine operation for grommets on his ears, and so there had been no need for him to be given that. So the only conclusion that his parents can really come to is that he was one of these unwitting guinea pigs, and he was infected as part of that systemic programme of trying to find out whether the blood was still dangerous.
And he's infected a month after his physician has told people to stop infecting other people with factor 8.
Correct. That's correct. And Colin's story is the one that breaks my heart the most. He weighed less than a 6-month-old baby when he died. He'd been completely emaciated. He used to have to be lifted up in a sheepskin to stop him from being injured by his parents. And when they came to take him home from the hospital because he was dying for his last Christmas, the doctors tried to stop him from being taken home because they told his parents that no undertaker would take his body because he had HIV. And all the time, while this absolutely horrific set of events was engulfing this family who were tending to a very, very poorly child, they were having AIDS daubed on their door and being subjected to abuse and harassment and ostracised by the community around them at the very time when they needed them more support than ever before. And I just find that so painful. I just find that just so painful.
Was there ever any sense of Dr. Bloom, the physician who administered the factor 8 to Colin, was he ever held to account?
No, not really. He's no longer around. He died some time ago, but there has been some retrospective thinking about his role. The unit that was once named after him, his name has now been removed from that unit, and the bust of him that was there has also been taken down. So there has been
in the hospital where he worked.
Where he worked in Cardiff. So there has been a kind of acceptance of his role in the scandal.
Caroline, you have been bringing these stories to light for years. And the reason many of us managed to hear the accounts, the personal testimony of people like Colin's parents, was because there has been a big public inquiry into infected blood. How did that inquiry finally come about, and what was your role in it?
Well, for a start, we never thought we'd get this far. And really the breakthrough came in the most surprising of ways to me. We'd been sort of building a campaign and a consensus, and I say we, myself and Diana Johnson, who's the Labour MP for Hull North and also the co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group on haemophilia and contaminated blood. And we'd been sort of working away on the political parties for many years, trying to get them to put a commitment to holding a public inquiry into the various manifestos. And in 2017, we had quite a few manifestos that were signed up to the notion of a public inquiry, including, crucially, the DUP. But obviously, in 2017, for a large portion of the Conservative Party campaign, Theresa May, who was the Prime Minister at the time, was 20 points ahead in the polls. And the prediction had been that she was going to sweep to a landslide victory.
Yeah.
But as you will remember, things didn't quite go to plan for the Conservative Party. At the end of the day, Theresa May lost her majority and she was propped up by the DUP. I'd recently changed newspapers and I'd come to join the Sunday Times. And one of the first times I'd gone back into Parliament after that election, I bumped into Diana Johnson and we were talking about contaminated blood and where the campaign was going to go next. And I just sort of casually mentioned to her that I thought we now had a majority for a public inquiry because we had the support of the DUP. And then I sort of said to Diana, well, we could get a letter together perhaps and try and get all the leaders of the parties that are in support of a public inquiry to sign a letter to the Prime Minister and try and, bounce them into it. And Diana thought about it and she said, leave it with me. Within a couple of days, she duly, and to her full credit, came back with a letter that was signed by all the party leaders. And yeah, it's quite funny that really the story that I'm most proud of in my journalistic career was a 350-word story on page 4 of the Sunday Times, which made reference to this letter. And just several weeks after Theresa May was returned to Downing Street, it was about 2 hours before Theresa May was due to stand up and address the Commons on the issue. And I got a phone call. And it was the Prime Minister's special advisor saying, would you take a call from the Downing Street switchboard? Yes, I would. A guy called Tim Smith came on the phone and he just said the words that I will never forget as I was standing in Portcullis House. Congratulations, 2 weeks into your new job and you've got your public inquiry.
And that public inquiry has been underway now for some time. Were there any moments in it that really startled you?
So many moments and just so much, I think the powerful testimonies were just unbelievably emotional, some of them.
Were you told anything about any risks associated with the use of the Factor 8 product?
No, nothing at all.
Were you told anything about differences between NHS products or American products?
It was never spoken about. We just believed the doctor. They were treating Colin, and it sounds terrible, but he was like a god to us, Prof Bloom, because he was looking after my son. So why would I ask any questions about it? We thought he was getting the best treatment possible.
Colin and Jan Smith, the parents of Colin Smith, their evidence was the most powerful evidence I've seen.
I could cope with death, but not with the death of my son. I still have trouble today, the fact that he's in a grave on his own, and the guilt will never go away.
But also moments where there was fury in the inquiry, the evidence of Ken Clarke.
Given the medical knowledge at the time, did anyone behave carelessly or negligently? And all I can say is personally, insofar as the areas I've now seen or I've been involved in, no, I don't think anybody, I can't see anything where I think anybody in the department should have acted differently.
And the slightly nonchalant way in which he delivered his response to the inquiry, really sent shockwaves through the inquiry room too.
And everything depends. It's true of all these inquiries, which we now set up so regularly. With hindsight, of course you can see things that we would do and would have done had we known the eventual outcome. And they obviously did not realise that I think a score now is almost 3,000 people were eventually, sadly, going to die. If they'd known that, they would have stopped Factor 8 straight away.
You mentioned Ken Clarke there. Was there more that governments in the interim could have done?
The one thing that would have been a game changer would have been if we'd reached self-sufficiency in terms of the blood products that we made in the United Kingdom. And David Owen, who again is one of the heroes of the piece in this, who was the health minister in 1975, when this burgeoning health crisis was emerging, was very clear that we needed to put in the infrastructure and the money to make sure that we became self-sufficient, but it never happened. During the course of writing this book, there are around 10 sort of characters that I used to tell the story of the infected blood scandal, and 2 of them died in the very short period of time it took for me to write this book. One was a guy called Nick Sainsbury, and he died in April. He'd given evidence to the inquiry and obviously we'll never see the findings of it. And the second was John Corns, and he also died in April. He had given evidence to the inquiry and he will never find out how it ended. It does feel like they are slowly dying out, and that's especially put into kind of stark focus when the statistics point to the fact that one haemophiliac is dying every 4 days of contaminated blood poisoning. What they want is answers and a sense of justice before it's too late.
People don't realise just what this thing has done to people. Took lives, maimed people, they're crippled with, such horrible things. We need justice. We need something done about this.
Caroline, when we spoke to you last September, the inquiry was still underway. We're speaking to you now on Monday afternoon. The inquiry has finally published its report. You've seen the report. You've managed to get through it very, very quickly. Give us a sense of what are the most important things that have come out of it.
The most important thing, the top line in this is that the judge that has chaired this inquiry, Sir Brian Langstaff, has concluded that this was not an accident. And that's something that the government has been hiding. And I'm talking governments of, all colours, and successive governments over the past 5 decades have been hiding behind and saying this was something that was unavoidable.
And the report makes it clear that, the risks of this blood being used were known. It also talks very directly about that sense of cover-up.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think one of the things that was really shocking, and there was a sort of intake of breath when the judge was talking about this in his summing up this afternoon, was that actually there had been conclusive proof that HIV was infecting people through the blood supply chain as early as 1982.
Wow.
And if you actually put that into context, if you think about the fact that it's still in 1983, Ken Clarke was saying to the House of Commons that there was no conclusive proof that HIV was bloodborne. that really puts into context the fact that there was a really long time delay between the risks of this being known and actually the government doing anything to warn people about it.
And it's very critical of ministers like Ken Clarke and prime ministers, Margaret Thatcher, John Major, also more recently, Rishi Sunak, because not only was there a cover-up for years, but also there's been a failure to pay any form of compensation.
That's right. That was what was quite interesting. There was a whole almost part chapter devoted to the last sort of year and a half. During that time period, almost 700 people have died who have been impacted and affected by this scandal without seeing justice, without seeing compensation, often dying in appalling circumstances given the financial impact that this scandal has had on them. So he basically said to them at the end, he wanted to see a timely response to this report, and thereby he expects them to come back with a package of compensation in short order. Because on so many occasions, the attempts to address this have been kicked down the road because the government has not wanted to pick up the tab. There's a real kind of nervousness that in some ways the government might try to shortchange the victims. So until we see that report tomorrow, I've still got a kind of gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach that even now it might not be the redress that they're looking for. And I just want to put that into context, which is this isn't about them, running off into the sunset in a Ferrari or going on a world cruise. These people have been through the most unimaginable suffering, either directly because they have been ill themselves or they have lost loved ones. But the impact on their finances has been immeasurable. Not being able to work, not being able to get a mortgage, not being able to get married, not having children, children that lost both parents and ended up in care in children's homes. I mean, you cannot put a price on that. And this is about coming up with a package of redress which gives them a life equivalent to that of which they might have had this not have happened to them.
The report is very critical of successive governments for the cover-up. It also talks about the NHS closing ranks, losing documents, destroying documents. What about the claim that we talked about earlier that it was also knowingly experimenting on children in particular? What did it say about that charge?
It's really interesting because when I was researching my book, that was the thing that struck me the most when I was kind of pulling all the documents together and looking at what had happened, was that it was unavoidable to conclude that doctors had been experimenting on children and previously untreated patients. It was very clear to me, doing all the research, that was going to have to be one of the key findings of this public inquiry, and indeed it was. And in some ways it's kind of a relief, because that was such a controversial thing. The idea that in this country, doctors who have signed up to a Hippocratic oath, who have signed up to a commitment to do no harm, had tested potentially lethal blood products on previously untreated patients who, for most part, were children, to test their infectivity. I mean, it's a staggering, staggering finding.
Given that these children, these students, had no say in the matter, they didn't even know the potential side effects of infection or what was happening to them, will there be any kind of criminal charge?
That's a really live debate with campaigners at the moment. I mean, there is one school of thought that it's taken so long to actually get to the findings of this report today that actually it's robbed the families really of there ever being any kind of prosecutions, because so many of the people that appear to have been culpable in all of this have already died. It's very unlikely that anybody will be brought to book for this. I think it's been a systemic failing, and I think that lessons will have to be learned from this, but I don't think that they're going to be learned by sending people to prison.
Caroline, you've been speaking to some of the victims and their families who've all gathered for this report's launch. What has their response been?
It's a funny word to say delighted, because there is no jubilation in any of this. There is no celebration in any of this. In fact, most of us today talking about it sort of described a feeling of numbness and sort of feeling hollow. But it is a vindication. I think, so much of what was written about had been known, and campaigners had been talking about it for decades, but had never got anybody to listen. and to, acknowledge what they were saying. Everything that they had previously said was being kind of dismissed as, them being conspiracy theorists. Today, we heard from one of the country's most prestigious judges who put in black and white what these victims had known had happened for years and had put rocket boosters under it by gathering so much damning evidence to support the fact that this had gone on and this had happened, that there had been wrongdoing, that there had been decision-making at every level that had been faulty, and that the people that had made those decisions then went to a huge effort to cover it up. And the judge said all of those things. So huge vindication for the campaigners today. But as I say, there won't be a party.
That was Caroline Wheeler from the Sunday Times, and you can find her full breakdown of the infected blood inquiry at thetimes.co.uk with a subscription. She's also written the most authoritative account of this scandal in her book, Death in the Blood. This episode was produced by Taryn Siegel. The executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design was by David Crackles and Mal Lassetto. If you found this a useful guide and you think others should hear it too, then please do share it with your friends or leave us a nice review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.